towards that island nation, beginning with Richard Curtis's conversation with Cord MacGuire, and after that we'll speak with local musician Frank French about his recent trip to Cuba as well. Cuba is our topic this morning on A Public Affair. It's 8:37. You're listening to Boulder County Community Radio. We are KGNU Boulder.
Saturday afternoon, February 24th, 1996. 2 Cuban MiG fighter jets shoot down 2 single-engine Cessna aircraft operated by a Cuban exile group called Brothers to the Rescue. According to the Cuban government, the pilots' group is a terrorist mafia that has worked out repugnant and bloody plans against the Cuban people. According to the Clinton administration, they're a humanitarian group. We've heard a lot lately about the American government's point of view. I'm Richard Curtis. With me in the studio is Cord MacGuire, spokesman for Coloradans to end the Cuba embargo. Cord, what is CECE's opinion?
Well, as you may expect, first of all, we're very disappointed at the results, and we think they're tragic. And we have argued for a long time now, Richard, that it's the ongoing hostility towards Cuba displayed by the U.S. that leads to events like this, and this isn't, after all, the first. In the 30 years that the U.S. has waged a rather long-standing covert war against Cuba.
Now, I understand that this particular group has violated Cuban airspace in the past and, in fact, gotten as far as the city of Havana. Also that they were warned some 6 months ago that the government would shoot them down should they violate the airspace again. Presumably they'd done that in the past as well. Why do you suppose the Cuban government chose to take this drastic action at this time?
Well, you're right. Brothers to the Rescue is gloats, actually, and are very proud of the fact that they're able to violate Cuban airspace in the past. They have dropped leaflets and they've advertised it. Now, when you look at this in connection with other interventions into Cuban airspace, you can easily account for the Cuban military's nervousness about this constant harassment and probing of their defenses. The Brothers to the Rescue were warned on innumerable occasions that they could face consequences like this. In fact, the Cuban government relayed several messages that we publicly know about to the State Department and the White House to the effect that they were wondering what the U.S. government would do if, in fact, the Cubans resorted to extreme measures to stop these flights once and for all.
And I understand that immediately prior to the events of Saturday, that a Cuban dissident, or perhaps non-dissident, reappeared in Havana with information about Brothers to the Rescue. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, it was an amazing thing. You may remember, Richard, a couple of years ago, there was a high-ranking Cuban Air Force officer who defected to the United States, and of course, he was hailed as a great catch by the folks in Miami. And he integrated himself into the Miami community, and one thing led to another, and he became an active member of Brothers to the Rescue, in fact. Now, it turns out, all along, that he was working for Cuban intelligence, and he was able to gain confirmation, he says, that the Brothers to the Rescue were closely working, were being aided by, were working in collusion with covert U.S. agencies, namely the CIA and others, who, as we all know, have been, it's an open secret, has been trying to undermine and sabotage the Cuban Revolution. Now, this just adds further justification to the Cubans' long-standing claims that these have been hostile, certainly threatening incursions into their sovereign airspace, and I suspect they finally wanted to take final action to put a stop to this once and for all, particularly given the fact that their diplomacy had been rebuffed time and time again by the Clinton administration.
Do you suppose that there is something larger going on in the picture here in terms of the Cubans' decision to assert this kind of control over their airspace at this time?
Well, I think part of it, Richard, would be Cuba's frustration with United States arrogance, frankly. We have a situation here where the world's only remaining superpower feels it has some sort of, is entitled to dictate to Cuba the policies that the United States would like to see in Cuba. Now, we in Coloradans end of the Cuba embargo feel that it's that attitude, in fact, that is driving these negative events, that is driving the outrageous wasting of our taxpayers' money in denying, after all, Americans, American business people and American tourists and American students from even traveling to Cuba. We say it's outrageous that the American people's travel rights, Cubans' national sovereignty, and I might add, international law are all being violated by this blockade of Cuba. And we think that only when the blockade is lifted can the United States be seriously taken as an advocate for international law.
Now, a lot of people have wondered about the timing of this incident vis-a-vis other international relationships that Cuba is establishing around the world. What have you heard about those implications?
Well, I've heard, well, it would appear at first glance that Cuba may be displaying a certain confidence, this strong point they're in fact making. Perhaps they feel that their diplomacy has had enough success in the last few years, since the end of the Cold War in particular, and it has strong allies around the world. You know, the U.S., we are the ones that are isolated by our government's policy to Cuba. Virtually every country in the world is opposed to our policy and sees our policy as, in fact, the problem in the Caribbean region.
Now, and how do we know that to be true?
Well, there are several UN votes on record. I believe 5 times now, the United Nations has voted overwhelmingly to condemn the U.S. blockade of Cuba as a gross violation of international law and normal interstate behavior. Now, of course, and unfortunately, our government ignores this, chooses to ignore this, dismisses these rulings. But of course, on the other hand, when the United States has a complaint about Cuba, they're quick to go to the UN and try to get a vote there. So the hypocrisy doesn't help us at all. It certainly doesn't help the people of Cuba. And once again, it's up to us here in the United States to try to change these policies through the diplomatic channels that we have available to us, rather than resorting to these extreme terrorist tactics that are advocated by our opponents down there in Miami.
Now, I understand also that Saturday the 24th was the 101st anniversary of the beginning of the Cuban Revolution against Spain. Do you suppose that somehow is playing into the passions involved on both sides?
Well, of course. That's a very passionate and patriotic time in Cuba, and to show this new flexibility that Cuba is anxious to display, they were going to permit on Saturday, on the big Cuban holiday, an unprecedented meeting, a public rally of the several small dissident groups that have long been active in Havana. And the Cubans were hoping that this would be seen as rather a concession to the United States. I could say, look, you know, we're opening up, we've liberalized our trade, now we're allowing these public demonstrations by groups that are hostile to us and who we know have connections to groups in Miami. So I'm sure that they were quite offended when the United States didn't appear to respond to this and, in fact, let these guys fly out of Miami in gross violation of international law and Cuba's sovereign air rights. Again, it's this hostile, arrogant provocation that, not surprisingly, led to this tragic incident.
And what is CECE's position on the basic issue of territorial rights? Do you see this as a matter of one state protecting its airspace, such as any other country would do, or is there something extraordinary in this action?
No, I don't even think it's that extraordinary. I think that, of course, we defend the rights of sovereign nations to defend their borders. We're opposed to the trend that's occurring in the world, where you have these NAFTA and GATT free trade deals that are pushed by the United States, which tend to erode national sovereignty. Now, of course, small third world countries like Cuba ought to be sensitive to their sovereign and national rights, because the whole problem, of course, it seems to me, that certainly countries in the Caribbean and South America have been facing, is that the U.S. has never respected their sovereignty, has always tried to push them around. and has always tried to use its overwhelming military and economic power to subjugate these people. Now, Cuba, of course, has managed to extricate itself from these conditions by the revolution they had in 1959, and are more than determined to preserve and protect the gains that they've had, and are prepared now clearly to stand up to the United States in all the various forums, including the military one.
This has been Richard Curtis speaking with Cord MacGuire of Coloradans to End the Cuban Embargo. With CECE, how would they get a hold of you?
You can just write to us at CECE, that's C-E-C-E, CECE, at P.O. Box 4602, Boulder, Colorado 80306. Or you can give us a call at 494-3122.
Thanks a lot for coming down.
Thank you, Richard.